All right, so today I'm trying to figure out what did I miss when I assembled this engine. Several weeks ago, if you remember, I primed all three of these engines, and the guys behind me primed up at made 60 psi, which they should, and this guy here only made 25. So after doing some checking of the bypass spring in here, determining it wasn't stuck and playing around with things, determined that the pan needs to come off. One of the other checks I did was I added a pressure gauge at the back there and made sure that the pressure at the back of the motor was the same as the front of the motor on the top end, so that again points to the bottom end. So I took it apart and I started looking around. I didn't see anything. And so I checked the crank to make sure the crank wasn't marked that it was cut. Here's a crank that's been cut. And here's how some machine shops mark their cranks when they're cut, with a paint pen. That's going to wash right off in the jet wash or with brake cleaner, carb cleaner. Some machine shops stamp them right here, or they grind them and use an electric pencil like down there. So obviously this one we're going to mark with electric pencil. This crank didn't need to be turned. It was in nice shape. So when I measured it, I made an assumption. We know how that is spelled. When I tore it down, either I missed it by not looking at the bearings, or I had somebody else tearing it down and they weren't paying attention, or they didn't know they needed to pay attention. Either way, this is on me. It's my fault. So here's how we missed it. This is what I use. It's a snap gauge. And this is a 250 snap gauge. So when I screw this guy up and he touches up here, when it touches off, I usually preload it. If it's down here, I'll bring it up to 0. It's preloaded about 5 thousandths. Usually, though, I preload it 10 to 20 thousandths just to be sure. So you can use this to measure the actual size of the crank, but you have to be very careful. So when it touches off on this will be considered standard. If it comes around another time, it's 10. Another time, it's 20. Another time, it's 30. So that's where I missed it. So how did I determine this? I took the rod bearing cap off. I put some plastic gauge in there. I found that the rod bearing, when I torqued it back up, did not crust the plastic gauge. So then I went to the bearing selection over here, and I took some 20s and some 30s, 10s, 20s, and 30s, and saw which ones would fit on the journal. It looked like 10 was the one to go with. So I put 10 in there. I torqued it up. I got me a measurement. It crushed. Okay, it's a 10. It's a 10 on the rods. So the mains are a little bit more tricky. The only way to check the mains without removing the crank is plastic gauge as well. You can see the line up there. The thin line is where I put the plastic gauge on it. The same piece of plastic gauge that's below it that's crushed. That guy didn't crush. So that was the standard bearing. So I took the standard bearing out and then put some 1010 bearings in there, and I torqued it up, and that's what I got. According to my spec sheet, I had 17 10 thousandths. So when I measured it with my plastic gauge, I like what I see, because that's right at 2 and that's at 1.5. So it's very close. So now I've confirmed I have a 1010 crank. So what that means is I got to change all the lower bearing inserts, I got to change all the rod bearing inserts, and I got to start from ground zero. It can be done. So that's what happens when you need to pay attention a little bit more, Steve. Another thing to look at is the rear seal. You can see the cap. You can see everybody's completely dry. Looks real good. There is the anaerobic. No real chance of a leak there other than the seal itself. So we're going to use this as a learning opportunity, and I will do a better job of looking after crank sizes when I take them apart. I also bought a micrometer to actually mic it, because we're all lazy. But that definitely is a 1010 crank, looking at that number. And you can mic a rod journal too. You can't mic a main when the crank's in the block. I didn't have this when I was determining what was wrong with it. So there you go. That's what happens when something doesn't work out right. We dig back out and we look into it. And this is still going to be just fine. I'm going to take the time and fix it and get the clearances where I want them. And we'll be back to the same stage as these guys, hopefully soon.